Russia has strongly criticized the US over its role in Syria. Moscow says the US is plotting to partition Syria. Russia's ambassador to the UN says the US-led coalition is doing through setting up local governing bodies in areas seized from Daesh. Vasily Nebenzia said, "We are receiving news that the coalition is directly involved in the creation of some local authorities in the areas freed from Daesh, with which they are discussing economic reconstruction measures. What the coalition is doing amounts to concrete steps to partition Syria." But the US is facing an uphill task if it is bent on partitioning Syria given the strong presence of Russia in the war-torn country. Meanwhile, international law is on the side of Syria, which has repeatedly reaffirmed it will not relinquish an inch of its territory.
It's been very evident for about a year and a half now that the Americans and their regional allies understand that the Syrian government is going to prevail in this terrible conflict, and therefore the ultimate aim of Washington and its regional allies to overthrow the Syrian government, to overthrow President Assad, has failed, and has failed abysmally. So they are now falling back on what we can call Plan B. And Plan B is, with no question or doubt in my mind, to retain a presence in the north of Syria, maybe to bring about partition in the north. That is a very real possibility. That said, however, I do believe that the American presence in the north of the country is precarious.
US media reports say, quote, "soft partition is an option to completely resolve the Syria crisis," calling it an emerging fact on the ground. The reports say a political settlement in Syria is a long way off, and dividing the country into statelets could be the solution to the impasse. Partition has been a taboo since the Syria conflict began in 2011, but Syria's adversaries have made veiled efforts to break it and insinuate as a reality which is taking hold.
The Americans are relying to a very large extent on the Kurds, but let's not forget the Kurds are working alongside the Americans, but they are also working alongside the Russians, and they are also working alongside the Syrian government. Now, whether or not the Americans can achieve Plan B to retain their presence in the north, to possibly bring about partition, really does depend on the intentions of the Syrian government, the Russian government and the Iranian government, because sooner or later, and I suspect the former, the Syrian military, once it has finished liberating the east of Syria, once it has finished liberating the south of Syria, will turn its attention to the northwest of Syria, where there are various Islamist Wahhabist terrorist groups, al-Nusra and the so-called Free Syrian Army.
But the US must have learned lessons from the recent developments in Syria. The White House will definitely find it very difficult and even near impossible to achieve its goal in Syria due to Russia's strong presence in the Arab country. The multifaceted war in Syria is one of the greatest challenges facing the US. Washington has deployed troops to Syria and armed some groups there, but its policy has been murky on the war that has ravaged the country for 6 years. But its lack of any plan and Russia's strong resolve to maintain its presence in the Mediterranean foiled America's schemes.
Well, the Syrian government has made the point on numerous occasions, and they are perfectly legal statements to make, legal as in it's in accordance with international law, with the UN Charter, that every inch of Syrian territory will be liberated.
Nicholas Van Dam, the author of the book Destroying a Nation, The Civil War in Syria, says the West created false expectations by demanding Assad resign in the initial years of the crisis in Syria, while only offering half-hearted support for its enemies and underestimating the cohesion of the Syrian president's leadership. Now, even the most optimistic supporters of regime change in Syria believe that Assad's removal is wishful thinking.